the fog of war. Ever heard that phrase? The fog of war? I want to share an illustration with you, and it'll help us get into what we're going to talk about today. It's actually an illustration from a book written by a couple of Navy SEALs and their experiences in Iraq, in the city of Ramadi. Some of the most bitter fighting that took place during the Iraq War. And talk about the fog of war. Bullets flying, and it was really a very difficult time. People were confused. Jocko, that's his real name. Jocko is the commander of this unit of SEALs. And he arrives on the scene in his very fortified Humvee. And they park the Humvee right behind the Abrams tank. Jocko gets out of his Humvee, makes his way carefully, because there's bullets flying back and forth. This is a dangerous scene. Makes his way carefully up to the Abrams tank, where he meets the Marine gunnery sergeant. And he asks the gunnery sergeant, what's going on? What's happening here? And the gunnery sergeant explains to him the situation. That this is a very dangerous situation. They were patrolling the area and suddenly they started taking on fire. They responded, but the enemy is very heavily fortified. They're in that compound over there. We've been exchanging bullets for I don't know how long, for quite some time. And it is just a very dangerous situation. And Jocko looks up and sees the turret of the Abrams tank pointed directly at the compound. He's been listening to the radio, so he knows the Marines are calling in air support. They're going to level this compound to the ground. But Jocko also knows that there's something not quite right here. Something is not kosher. Something is just not working the way it should be. And he also knows he has a SEALs team somewhere in this area. So he tells the gunnery sergeant to stand down while he and another fellow SEAL go across the street and check out this compound. The gunnery sergeant thinks he's absolutely out of his mind crazy. You're going to get yourself killed. But he's a good soldier. He stands down. And Jocko and this other SEAL make their way across the street. They get to the compound wall. They can see that the door is slightly ajar. They have their rifles at the ready. They go to the door, they kick it in, and there they are face to face, eyeball to eyeball, with their own SEAL team. The Marines and the SEALs have been shooting at each other. In the fog of war, this became a case of friendly fire. It became a play, what they call it in the book, blue on blue was the phrase that they used. Everyone was angry, everyone was upset, everyone was mad, especially Jocko. Because he knew this was going to be one tough debriefing. All the way back to base, he's thinking about how this happened, what was causing this to happen, how did all of this transpire, and he's trying to figure this all out. He gets back to the base, he calls in the individual SEALs, he interviews them, he talks to them, he's got the timeline, he knows what happened, but something is just not clicking. Something is just not making sense. And as he sits there and he thinks about it, and the clock is clicking down on the time until the debriefing, suddenly it comes to him. And he knows what's missing. The time for the debriefing arrives, and Sure enough, the brass is all there. The commanding officer, the investigating officer, the CMC. I always get this backwards. CMC, do you know what that is? Chief Command is? I've got it written down here somewhere. Command Master Chief, that's it. The Command Master Chief. I mean, all of the brass is there, the SEAL team is there, and Jocko is in charge, and he's got to do the debriefing. He walks into the tent, he walks up to the front, he stands in front of his men, and he says, "Who is to blame here? Whose fault was this today?" They look around at each other. And finally, one young SEAL stands up and says, "It was my fault. I was the one who took the first shot. I saw an Iraqi soldier. I saw he had a gun. And I shot, and I didn't realize that he was an Iraqi soldier fighting with the Marines, not against them." Jocko says, "No, it wasn't your fault. This was not your mistake. You're not to blame. Sit down. Who's to blame? Whose fault is this? Who do we blame for this today?" Again, they looked at him. And the next person to stand up was the radio man. The radio man said, "It's my fault. If I'd have known better where we were in the situation, I could have reported a clearer picture to the other people, and people would have known where we were. It's my fault that people didn't know where we were. That's my fault." And Jocko said, "No. You are not to blame. It is not your fault. Sit down. Who's to blame? Whose fault? Who created all of this mess that we saw today?" They're running out of people here. And so finally the advisor, he stood up and said, "Well, okay, I'll take the blame. If I had advised them better, if I had made the plan out better and prepared these men for what they were going into, maybe none of this would have happened." And Jocko said, "No. It's not your fault either. Whose fault is it?" And then Jocko said, "It's mine. It's mine. I was the leader. I was the commander of this group. I'm the one who sent you in there, and all of this is on me. I take the responsibility, and I take the blame. But this is not going to happen again. We're going to make darn sure this does not happen again." Okay. You've heard about the fog of war. But have you heard about the fog of church work? The fog of church work. Sometimes I think it's almost as dangerous. As people get busy and things get to happening and things start growing, things can get really messy really fast, and it's easy for there to be a blue on blue, to suffer friendly fire. And if you remember, that's exactly what Paul is dealing with at the church in Corinth. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. But why is Paul writing to the church in Corinth? It's because Chloe's people, whoever they were, family or servants or whoever, but they're associated with this Chloe person, has contacted Paul and told him that the church in Corinth is fighting. They're fighting with each other. They're at each other's throats. And so Paul says, "Fine, I'll write to them. I'll try to take care of this." Do you remember what they were fighting about? Do you remember what they were arguing over? Well, Paul had founded the church. He had planted the seed. And then it grew. And then a little while later, Apollos came and he watered the church and it continued to grow. But now the people in the church are fighting about who they follow. I follow Paul, I follow Apollos. They're fighting over which one of these leaders that they're going to follow. And so Paul writes back to the church, who is Paul? Who is Paul? Who is Apollos? Yes, I planted the church. I planted the seed and it grew. Yes, Apollo came along and he watered the seed a little bit and watered the seed and it continued to grow. But I'm just a planter. Apollos is just a waterer. We're nothing. It's God that made it grow. God is the one that you should be following. God is the one that should be getting all the credit. Paul and Apollos didn't do anything except our jobs. We did what we were called to do. And we're brothers. We work together for the benefit of the kingdom of God. We've done nothing except what God has called us to do. We're saved by grace through faith just like you. And we came and we planted and we watered and we worked together to grow this church. So God can make it grow, but we're nothing. We are nothing. It's God that has made it grow. God is the one. But you are the field. You're the field that God is growing. You are the building that God is constructing and putting together. And isn't it amazing what God is doing amongst you? Can't you see it? We just did our jobs. But God is creating something new. But growing's not easy, folks. Growing can be very difficult. What works with 50 doesn't necessarily work with 100. What works with 100 doesn't necessarily work with 200. As you grow in number, you also need to grow in spirit. And all this petty fighting and arguing amongst yourselves is doing no one any good. Hannah Whitehall Smith was a speaker and a writer during the 19th century in Britain. She worked with the Holy Spirit movement that was going big at the time in Europe and somewhat here as well. The Holiness Movement, that's what it was called. Famous writer, author, speaker. But she had a friend who was a very candid friend. At one time, this friend said to her, Hannah, you Christians seem to have a religion that makes you miserable. You are like a man with a headache. He doesn't want to get rid of his head, but it pains him to keep it. Is that the message that we're sending? Is that the message that we are conveying when guests and visitors come and see? Is that the message that we're sending out our doors, out into the community, that we're like a man with a headache, our faith, our religion makes us miserable? I hope not. I hope not. What did Paul say to the church in Corinth? Paul and Apollos are nothing. We're nothing. It's God that is making it grow. We didn't do anything. We just planted it. We watered a little bit. We did our jobs. God is the one that made it grow. But maybe the real message is in what Paul did. And what Jocko did as well. The real message is how Paul handled the situation. When Chloe's people came and reported to him about the church in Corinth, Paul could have said, Corinth? That was ages ago. I came, I planted, I had a good church going, and then this Apollos fellow, he came in and he messed it all up. Let Apollos fix it. It's not my job. I've got other things to do. He could have washed his hands of the whole thing and said, it's not my problem. I did my job. But that's not what he did. He took responsibility for what he did. Yes, he started the church. He feels a kinship, a closeness with this church, and he writes back doing everything in his power to make sure they stop what they're doing. It's not about me, it's about God. It's not about Apollos, it's about God. Stop the bickering and stop the fighting. Stop the arguing. Paul took responsibility. He owned up for his share in what he started. The same way for Jocko. When Jocko walked into that debriefing, heads could have rolled. Who's to blame? And that first SEAL stood up and said he was the one that shot without knowing who he was shooting at. Jocko stood and said, yeah, you're right. This is on you. Who else? The radio, well, I wasn't sure what, yeah, you're right. It was you too. And the advisor, when he stood up, yeah, it's on your head too. Incriminations, bickering and fighting, demotions all around. But that's not what Jocko did. He walked in there and he took the responsibility on himself. He took it on himself. I was the leader. I was the commander. I am part of this. It's on me. But it's not going to happen again. It's what Jocko did. It's what Paul did. This does not need to happen in the church. And we've said, we've committed ourselves to growing. We have a mission statement. It's on the wall. To love God with all our hearts, to love all others, and to spread the good news of Jesus Christ. And we said that we believe if we do that and do that right, we will grow, that God will make us grow. But hear the words of Paul. Growing is not easy. It sounds like a lot of fun to grow, but growing is going to put pressure on our systems. Growing is going to put pressure on our different groups and our different organizations within the church. And we need to grow with it. We need to do what Paul did. We need to do what Jocko did and take responsibility upon ourselves. I was here. It's my fault. I'm to blame. Paul called it spirituality. Jocko called it extreme ownership. It's the same thing. We need to grow. As we grow in numbers, we also need to grow in our responsibility. And take responsibility and realize it's not us. It's not us that makes it grow. It's God. But we are the field. We are the building that God is putting together, that God is constructing. And I don't know about you, Clara, but I can't wait to see what God is going to do. I can't wait to see what God is going to do with this church. I can't wait.